In 2022, nearly 80,000 Americans died from fentanyl overdoses, a death toll that dwarfs those of other drugs like heroin, methamphetamine, and cocaine. Fentanyl, a synthetic opioid up to 100 times more potent than morphine, has become the deadliest drug in the United States. Its rapid proliferation is largely fueled by its ease of production and high profit margins, and much of this deadly substance originates in Mexico, where drug cartels have seized control of its production and distribution. These cartels, already notorious for their involvement in cocaine and heroin trafficking, have now found an even more lucrative business in fentanyl, solidifying their power both in Mexico and abroad. As fentanyl ravages American communities, claiming tens of thousands of lives each year, U.S. policymakers are grappling with how to address the escalating crisis. The Mexican drug cartels responsible for smuggling this lethal drug into the U.S. have grown stronger and more violent, posing not only a public health threat, but also a national security risk, as the cartels entrench themselves deeper into Mexican society, infiltrating politics and law enforcement. Some American lawmakers are contemplating an unprecedented step with military intervention to dismantle the cartels and curb the flow of fentanyl into the United States. The rise of fentanyl, a new era of drug trafficking. To understand why U.S. policymakers are considering military action, it is important to examine how fentanyl became the dominant force in the drug trade. Unlike traditional drugs like heroin or cocaine, which are derived from natural plant sources, fentanyl is entirely synthetic. It can be produced in labs using chemical precursors, many of which are imported from China and India. This synthetic nature gives fentanyl several advantages over other drugs. It is cheaper to produce, easier to smuggle in small quantities, and far more potent. In the past, Mexican drug cartels primarily focused on smuggling drugs like marijuana, heroin, and cocaine into the U.S. However, with the legalization of marijuana in many American states and the declining demand for heroin, the cartels have pivoted to fentanyl as their primary moneymaker. The Sinaloa Cartel and the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, JENG, two of the most powerful criminal organizations in Mexico, are at the forefront of this shift. These cartels have established sophisticated networks for manufacturing and trafficking fentanyl, often mixing it with other drugs like cocaine or counterfeit prescription pills to increase their profits. The cartel's fentanyl operations are built on a highly efficient supply chain. Chemical precursors are imported from China, either directly to Mexico or through intermediate countries like India. In clandestine labs hidden throughout rural Mexico, the cartels synthesize these precursors into fentanyl, which is then smuggled across the U.S. border. The drug is often concealed in vehicles, hidden among legitimate goods, or carried by drug mules. Once inside the U.S., it is distributed by local criminal organizations, sometimes with tragic results. Because fentanyl is so potent, even tiny miscalculations in dosage can lead to fatal overdoses. The growing influence of Mexican cartels. As the fentanyl trade has flourished, so too has the power of the Mexican drug cartels. In many parts of Mexico, the cartels have become de facto rulers, controlling territories through a combination of fear, violence, and corruption. Local police forces, outgunned and underfunded, are often powerless to stop them. In some cases, they are even complicit in cartel activities, accepting bribes or working directly with criminal organizations. This corruption extends beyond local police forces and into the highest levels of government. The rise of the cartel's influence has also brought an escalation in violence. In recent years, Mexico has seen record numbers of homicides, many of them linked to the ongoing turf wars between rival cartels. The SING, in particular, has gained a reputation for its extreme brutality, employing military-style tactics and heavy weaponry to eliminate its rivals. The cartels have also begun to forge alliances with foreign criminal organizations, including gangs in the United States and criminal syndicates in Europe, further extending their global reach. The cartel's influence is not confined to the drug trade. They have also infiltrated politics, using their immense wealth to buy off politicians and law enforcement officials. In some regions, the cartels effectively control local governments, dictating policy and ensuring that their operations continue unimpeded. This has made it incredibly difficult for the Mexican government to combat cartel activity, as any efforts to crack down on the cartels are often met with resistance from corrupt officials. The U.S. response: a growing sense of urgency. As the fentanyl crisis continues to claim lives in the U.S., pressure is mounting on policymakers to take decisive action. For years, the U.S. government has pursued a strategy of drug interdiction and law enforcement cooperation with Mexico, providing financial assistance and training to Mexican security forces in an effort to dismantle the cartels. However, these efforts have yielded limited success. The cartels remain deeply entrenched, and the flow of fentanyl across the border has only increased. In recent months, a growing number of U.S. lawmakers have begun to advocate for a more aggressive approach including the possibility of military intervention. Proponents of military action argue that the cartels have become so powerful and violent that they now pose a national security threat to the United States. They point to the cartels' control over large swaths of Mexican territory, their sophisticated smuggling operations, and their ability to bribe or intimidate government officials as evidence that law enforcement alone is no longer sufficient to combat the crisis. Some U.S. policymakers have even called for the cartels to be designated as foreign terrorist organizations, FTOs, a move that would allow the U.S. government to target the cartels with military force, much as it has done with groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS. Under this designation, the U.S. military would have greater authority to conduct operations against the cartels, including drone strikes, raids on cartel compounds, and the destruction of drug labs. While the idea of military intervention has gained traction among some lawmakers, it remains highly controversial. Critics argue that such an approach could have serious unintended consequences. For one, military action in Mexico could exacerbate tensions between the U.S. and its southern neighbor, potentially undermining the cooperation that is crucial to addressing the fentanyl crisis. Mexico's government has been vocal in its opposition to U.S. military involvement, warning that such actions would be a violation of Mexican sovereignty and could lead to a breakdown in diplomatic relations. There are also concerns about the effectiveness of military action in combating the cartels. While the U.S. military has had success in targeting terrorist groups in the Middle East, the situation in Mexico is vastly different. The cartels are deeply embedded in Mexican society, with extensive networks of informants, corrupt officials, and loyal foot soldiers. Unlike terrorist groups, which operate primarily in remote areas, the cartels have a significant presence in urban centers, making military operations far more complicated and likely to result in civilian casualties.